Hi, this is Janet Fitch, and it is noon on Wednesday, so that means it is Writing Wednesday when I answer your writing questions about craft, about morale, about literature, and whatever you want to talk about. It's you can write to me in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer, or you can write to me through my website, janetfitchwrites.com, and ask me a question. I can devise a Writing Wednesday around your question. So don't be shy. If you have questions, I can guarantee you that there are hundreds of people who have questions, that same question, so that other people will be happy to get the benefits of your daring in asking the question. So for me, it is late September. It's a very good time to work on your weather notebooks, to keep track of what's going on in the season, in the light, in the vegetation, the feel of heat coming in through the window like an easy bake oven, or perhaps you're in Florida in the middle of a hurricane. If so, be careful of your battery life. But definitely time to record your sense impressions, what you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're seeing. In any case, these rapid changes of season, the going into fall and spring, are both pretty active times. And can you capture that light? Can you capture the way the shadows are thrown on the walls? Things that were in sun in summer are suddenly in shadow because of the change of the orientation of the sun. Do you sleep better? Do you sleep worse? What's outside the window? Do you keep the window closed because of the smog, or do you leave it open? Different seasons have different sounds. So I would encourage you to keep up your weather notebook. And it's not just it was hot, it was September, but really, what do you notice? What are you noticing on the sense level about, like we have persimmons this year and they're sunburned. It's been such a hard summer that the persimmons are streaked in black and the upper leaves are dry. It's specific. In fiction, it's you can say it's not what you know, it's what you notice. And so take the time to notice and record what you're noticing, because you'll need it 8 months from now. You won't remember this part. Anyway, I have had some questions from the listeners on the internet, and I thought I would let's take this first one from Ted. He asks, is fiction writing declining? Is fiction in a decline? Well, I've got to say that fiction writing as an activity certainly hasn't declined. I think the personal computer has really made writing less strenuous and difficult on the hands and on the body. Our ability to redraft has, exploded. It used to be rewriting something was quite a time-consuming task, and you cut stuff up and you got pages of different lengths, and as you're literally cutting and pasting, and then you have to type the whole thing over again. So what was the effect of that on the gene pool of writers? I'll say that it's It certainly is a more daunting physical process. I think it kicked out a lot of people who didn't have the patience to retype that thing. It was less fluid. It favored the people who wrote and edited as they went. Either people would type it or they would write by hand and then have someone else usually type it. And so you had an opportunity then to see it fresh in a way that you just can't anymore. It's very difficult. What I do is sometimes I will type a chapter that I'm struggling with, or that I've gone over so many times I can't see it anymore. I will format it differently. I might format it like a printed page using a different typeface, single space instead of double, and make it look more like a page in a book. Often I see it differently. I don't like the way it looks. There are too many paragraphs, too many short paragraphs. I can see that when I've formatted it like a book page. I like a certain look of a page. And you can, the eye, it's funny because I've entitled this, What the Ear Can Hear, and writing for the ear, and I'm talking now about looking at my work and seeing it the way I want to see it on the page, the way when I look at a page of fiction, say somebody submits something to me for a quote, I'll look at the work on the page and I will have certain judgments about it based on how it looks on the page. Too many short paragraphs tells me the writer doesn't go down into the thoughts of the characters, that they're not taking the time to describe things, they're not going down into the heart of the scene, they are moving across the top of the scene and not digging down into it. I can see it. It's in the short paragraphs. When I open a manuscript somebody's sent for a quote, if I see big, deep paragraphs, that's what I want to see. I want to see them going down into the story and getting those big paragraphs. And there's a reason it looks the way it looks. I also, same with the dialogue. I see a lot of dialogue marching down the page. This is a person who hasn't shaped the dialogue scene using all the techniques that a writer has. I mean, if they're very short chapters, that's one thing. But if you just see those marching dialogue, even if perhaps the dialogue is good, and when I actually sit down and read it, it'll suck me in, my first reaction is just like stripped dialogue. Where's their world? It's not a big delineated world. So it always puts me off a bit. Is fiction writing declining? It's hard to say because there's so many more people involved in the fiction process, in the publication of books. So many more people involved now. So many more readers of a very wide range of abilities. So many more writers, partly because of the laptop computer has just made it easier to physically, on the body, to write. I think it is more democratic. We don't pay people to type our manuscripts after we've made a complete mess of them, physically trying to cut and paste and write notes on the manuscript, and you just have to have somebody to do that. That used to be a couple $100, which used to be quite a bit of money. I'm reading, as many of you know, I am reading Steinbeck's Journal of a Novel, where he writes every morning before he writes a letter to his editor, which becomes a journal because he doesn't actually send them, of his writing of East of Eden. So every morning he will write about writing East of Eden before he writes it. And he talks about the calluses. When you used to write longhand, he would use a pencil. He always used a round, he was very fussy about his pencils. He always used a round pencil as opposed to the hexagonal ones that we usually use as Ticonderogas, because they bothered his finger less. That ridge would eventually get massive callus right there. I still have mine, and I write with a computer. He would only use the pencil until he could feel the metal end, the ferrule, there's a word for it, against his hand, and then he'd give it to his kid. He didn't want to feel that metal on his hand. But he would have, the callus would get so large that he would have to sandpaper it down. I mean, this is the kind of thing, you can still see the bump on my finger, my writing finger. I don't mean to give you the finger, but that's a writer's callus, and it is, and I don't even write longhand very much anymore, but it certainly was part of my life. So writing is easier physically, it is more democratic, people have access to books, they have, library access loans and stuff. I mean, I can get a book out of the library here in Los Angeles, admittedly, it's Los Angeles, but our 74 libraries are interconnected. I can get a book from any one of 74 libraries delivered to my library to read it. People have ebooks, they can download, they can listen on audio. I think access to books is greater at this moment anyway. What time is it? Than it ever has been. But the question really is fiction writing in decline? Somebody said there's a law called Sturgeon's Law saying 90% of anything is garbage. So the more books being published, then of course, there's going to be more garbage being published, or mediocre, So is it in decline? Well, the numbers are not in decline. Sales are not in decline. The numbers of readers are not in decline. It's just more, it's a huge operation. Still a lot of people read. But alas, the level of literacy in the people who do read is probably not as high as it had been in the last century. So you can say there's an aspect there of more democratic writing for a wider swath of people than were generally considered. But I think penny dreadfuls, I think there's been bad writing all along. I think that the level of I won't say literacy, but even beyond literacy, the ability of the average person to read at the level that they read in the 19th century has gone down. The vocabulary has gone down. I think it's just been too hard. There's been too much to learn. That people in high school do not read at the same level that people in high school read at in, say, my father's day, which might have been your grandparents' day, or great-grandparents' day. If you read the letters on the battlefield in the Civil War, Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, even elementary school educated people had quite a good level of vocabulary. People read Dickens. I mean, that is considered difficult by many people now. They don't have the vocabulary anymore, and they don't have, it's true that people do not have the same level of focus because there's so many other things that they could be doing. To sit there and read a dense 19th century novel, I think is more difficult even for, people who are capable of reading at that level. They hesitate to plunge in. It's easier to read 3 books that are pitched at the 8th grade level than to read 1 book that's pitched, somewhat higher. So is that, is fiction in decline? No, fiction is not in decline. People love stories. People want to be transported. And there is quite an interesting liminal area, tidal area, where land and sea meet, where these different properties come together of people's time. I always was told to write for the 5 smartest people you know. It will keep you writing at the top of your game. But what about the people who aren't at the top of their game? What do? Do you worry about them? Do you give them signposts so that they can follow along? Are you concerned with the level of your readers' abilities? And every writer has to answer that question individually. How many handholds are you going to give the reader? Some people are rather demanding, writers who are very demanding, and they want the reader to meet them halfway. And if they're, somebody of some ability, those are going to be hard books. You might have to look up some words. You might have to go back and go, who was talking? The writer risks. The writer is taking a risk that in making a book that will please a sophisticated reader and offer them puzzles and problems and difficulty to chew on and enjoy for a certain sector of readers, they are going to lose a swath of readers, at least until scholarship catches up to them and there's a way for the average reader to approach these books. Somebody interested. How much of a break do you give your readers? How much do you lead them along? How much do you allow them to catch up? I do think that readers don't like when there's too many signposts and hand-holding and arrows and the reader that I'm picturing in my mind when I write is somebody who is interested in story as well as form, who wants to be moved emotionally as well as tickled, even more so than being tickled intellectually. I'm looking for that emotional reader who wants to be in the story and live in the life of these people and be moved, kind of opened up. Which is not to say that I don't believe in language, but language can be very common. There's no reason it has to mystify anything. So there's work that is deliberately difficult because it's what Mayakovsky called art for the producer. This is difficult. He was in a time where avant-garde artists were attacked for being elitist. Does that sound familiar? They were attacked for being elitist. And in early Soviet Russia, this was a much more dangerous label than it is now, because everything was for the proletariat. So what do you do about these people who are writing difficult work that isn't easy for the average person? What do? You just shoot them? I mean, that was a danger at that time. And Mayakovsky stepped up for these avant-gardists. And he was he fashioned himself a proletarian artist, which he really wasn't. But so he had some sympathy for these people. And he said, there's art for the producer and art for the consumer. And he said the art for the producer is art that feeds the art form. That the progress of art comes through its most advanced members. So mostly what he's saying is most of those poems, or, mostly they were poets. These poets feed the poets who are going to write for the proletariat, but they keep the art from becoming just this marketplace object. They keep the art fresh. They keep the writers for the consumer moving ahead in the art form and not just catering to the lowest common denominator, not doing the easy thing. They are being informed by these more avant-garde, riskier writers. So he said you needed both. So what this means is that when people who want to write for the writer, for the sophisticated reader, everybody has their sort of where they kind of sit in the literary spectrum. And the avant-gardists were like way over here, and then the, what they call the proletarian poets were way over here. And what Mayakovsky says is you gotta let this avant-garde, the head, the first wave, really you've got to let them have the freedom to do their take their risks, do their amazing art, so that the writers who are creating for a more general audience keep being sparked. They keep being sparked by this riskier, exciting, but kind of difficult work. And it starts to become absorbed in the more general culture. So how far to, whether or not writing is declining, the physical writing, the level of the sentence is declining, which I've got to say, it is not the most popular books from earlier eras, the classics, not necessarily the most popular, but the classics, the ones that have survived from earlier times, are far more literate. The diction, the reading level is more sophisticated. It's further. We have allowed less and less literate stuff to be considered, in the top ranks of writing. But that doesn't mean you have to go there. It means that you should have some sense of the times you're living in, some sense of the modern reader, rather than, scolding the reader, which I think is really, reality is reality. You sort of have to say, okay, yeah, that's true. The average reader finds Dickens very difficult. They find Tolstoy somewhat difficult. They find the great writers of a last century to be more difficult than, people did back then. But they also are more open to different voices. They're also more open to interesting forms. We live in a time where form has just exploded, and people are trying all kinds of new forms. It's very interesting. And in that sense, the avant-garde has reached the mainstream. If the last 3 books I read were almost all, but most of them were hybrid books, were books that took a lot of different forms and really very playful with form. For myself, I'm more interested in content. I like to read it, interesting form, but form is never my goal, never my primary playground. It's a playground. I love to look at it. I love to see those acrobats up on the tightrope and what they're doing, but it affects me more subtly. I'm not imitating it, because I'm interested in a different kind of experience when somebody reads my book. I want to move people deeply. I want people to feel more human, so these sophisticated playgrounds to me are only tempting. They're always interesting, but they're only tempting to me as a writer if they amplify the experience that the reader is having, amplify the emotional connection, the sense of being alive, the sense of this world, the things of this world. I guess I'm kind of a realist writer, and I celebrate this world. I also mourn it. But I live in it, and my characters live in it too. So is fiction declining? It's changing. It's not good to be one of those people. It's like it was better in the olden days, because that kind of golden days thinking is usually mythological. You're picturing a certain golden day without looking at what's around it. Who didn't we hear from? What didn't we see? What was excluded from that? It was not a golden time. It was a time that had its own political moment, its own linguistic moment, its own musical moment, etc. And you can look at these writers of the past and decide what you want to bring into the present moment. So is writing declining? Attention span is declining. But to everything I would say, I can think of an opposite example. See, this is why I'm a novelist, not an essayist. I can see an opposite example, for every. People are liking shorter books. People are liking these more experimental fiction in a more mainstream context. People are accepting hybrid work in a way that they would not have before. People are accepting fragmentation on a level they never would have accepted. It would have been completely the province of the producer. And now, novels on the bestseller list have these fragmentations and texts and letters and pieces of movies and all kinds of stuff in them. You don't even know if they're fiction or nonfiction. Though that line is blurring. So whether or not it's in decline doesn't matter. It's like we have to think about our own project. What is it that we want to add to literature? What do we want to add to that spectrum? Where do we stand? With awareness of what other people are doing, with awareness of our times, that what are we going to add to the conversation? Some people just say, hey, I just want to write my book about, the 2 groundhogs, and I don't care about literature. Well, that's literature for the consumer. But it's always better to consider what kind of conversation are you having. Literature is a conversation which is already in motion when you come onto the freeway, and you have to decide, what what conversation are you going to have? What are you going to add? Where do you posit yourself in terms of the literature of the present and in terms of the literature of the past? Like, who are you writing for, and what do you want from them, and what are you giving them? I think it's important. So Pedro says, thanks for a great talk. Thank you. The spark. And speaking of literature from another era, I remember loving Shelley's Frankenstein when I read it years ago, especially pleased to learn many words, vocabulary words, including the word countenance to describe the look on a person's face. And the book opened my imagination quite a bit. Yeah, when you read the work of the past, the best way to take on vocabulary is to read books that were written in the 19th century, when educated people had quite a sophisticated level of vocabulary. Is guess at what the word means. Write it down as you come across it. Guess at what it means. Write that down. Don't look it up. Keep reading, keep reading. Every time you come across a word you don't know, guess as to what it means. Then when you're done reading for the day, take out your dictionary and see what it really means. You'll find, I'd say, 70 to 80% of the time that you guessed right. You guessed it from the context. Sometimes you get it like totally dead wrong and you just laugh your head off because it was just the opposite or some crazy thing that you never thought of. You will always remember those words once you've looked them up. So that's a good way of vocabulary building. Very important in writing is you have to be able to have the words describe what you're talking about. So Zunaid says, if the technology available to us at this time has arguably increased the ease with which we can do things like research and write than in Steinbeck's time, why then are we still complaining about not having enough time or being too distracted or having too much to do, etc.? Well, I think that we have more superficial entertainment available at the touch of a button on the device on which you're working. I mean, that's distraction at the site of creation. So that's very dangerous. I mean, Steinbeck had to get up and leave the room and hunt around for something to distract him. You know, he didn't have it alive right behind East of Eden. So I think that that's true. Research at the time was library research, digging. You'd make a list of your questions, just like we talked about with building vocabulary. When things are not instantaneous, then it's not easy come, easy go. What you lose in immediacy, you gain in depth and in kind of solidity. When I have to write questions that I am going to research and go to the library and go dig out books that may or may not have the information I need, and I'll sit there at a table with 12 books and I'll be going through the index and try and finding things that seem to relate to what I want, and I'll go through the book and I'll read this, no, and then you find it. It's like, that's what I was looking for. You write it down on little cards or however your system used to be. That's going to stick with you a lot more than just Googling something, you know, as you're eating your lunch. Google, you know. Oh yeah, okay. So I think the effort is the antidote to the distraction. So we always complain about it not having enough time. Everybody always complains about that. You know, Steinbeck had children. You know, he had 3 wives. He had children. From number 2, he was lucky he had a wife who took on a lot of the crapola that, you know, most people have to deal with. But there's always the dentist, there's always the plumbing, there's always bills, there's always something. But they're not right in your face the way they are now. So I think that we, you know, however you can divorce yourself from the momentary distraction that you're looking up something that you think you need for your, you know, a name for something, and then you end up an hour later reading about pear in fudge, you know, sauce. That didn't happen to Steinbeck. So we have to just be aware of how easy that is. So Susan says, just joining in, I've noticed short paragraphs through most modern short stories. This is the preferred way in short stories. I'm practicing with shorts to build up a novel, but naturally write longer sentences and paragraphs. Well, I think that the longer sentences and paragraphs are a fine thing that show that you go down into subject and you don't just walk along the surface. So, on the other hand, modern short stories are, it's such an ephemeral thing. There's, you know, when I see the story of the New Yorker, generally I see deep paragraphs. But some people write short paragraphs. They write short sentences, they write short paragraphs, and they're beautiful. And it's like those ships made of glass, you know, they're just perfect. They're beautiful. So I don't like to generalize, but it should have some, I mean, if you're writing a 6-page short story, I would understand shorter paragraphs. Writing a 30-page short story, I would be expecting bulkier. People write differently, but that short paragraph is always, for me, often a sign of indifferent writing. Or not indifferent, but maybe not examined the way I like to see language examined. Let's see. So I have a question here about how do I improve my fiction writing skills? Well, of course, that's where we're that's the whole point of Writing Wednesday. So how can I improve, this is Stephen, how could I improve fiction writing skills? And what I decided to talk about today was sound. To make sure that there's some sound in your sentences, that it works for the ear as well as the eye. So we're talking about the poetics of fiction. Is there music in the sentences? I was recently reading the new translation of Beowulf by Maria Devana Headley. And there is such wonderful, it's an ancient poem that she has brought up to the present day. She is a wonderful poet, and it's funny. It's loaded with archaicisms, with anachronisms, and anachronisms are not just throwbacks, as we often think that means. Anachronism is just language that isn't of the time. Achrono, so non-time. So it starts like bro, you know? I mean, she throws modern stuff in there in a very humorous way. It makes the poem both more clear and adds this level of whimsy that I just love. Bro, let us talk of, well, how does it go? Tell me we still know how to speak of kings. I just love that. There's a lot of they're funny. They tend to be humorous. But the thing that is true of every Beowulf from the original to the Old English, the first time it was written down, through all the translations, is it maintains its poetics, which in those days tended not to be a rhyme scheme or a straight meter, da 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 da, iambic pentameter or whatever the rhyme scheme. It generally works on, and nobody cares about this, accentual poetry. It had a break in the middle, so there was a phrase and then another phrase, and it works on, there's a lot of assonance and alliteration, which means the sound, it's woven together with sound repetitions. For us fiction writers, you don't have to get too caught up in the details of prosody, which means poetry rules. That's a bridge too far for us. But to notice just what you can do with alliteration, it makes these poetic devices. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds, and assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. That's all it means. And the alliterations in this thing wove early, whatever this was, Viking, Old English poetry together, was strong on the repetition of consonant sounds, alliteration. And the alliterations are so great in here. And working with these poetic devices, it kind of sharpens your sword a bit, because you're trying to express the thought and find another S, because you need an S to make the alliteration. And you end up with wonderful things, like let's see, I have this marked, but I don't know what I marked. Just a line like, when war woos him, as war will, he'll need those troops to follow the leader. So follow the leader, that's the anachronism. So she's, just throwing that in. She's rolling, she's riffing. And when she's thinking of, to follow the leader, it's a children's game for those of you who might have had a stroke or something, if you remember that. So, she's throwing in this modern thing that doesn't really belong there, but is very fun. It fits. But the when war woos him, as war will, that's not, she is finding a way to express what was in the original and get that repetition to, those W's, when war woos him, as war will. Privilege is the way men prime power. These poetic devices are something that gives the snap, crackle, and punch and pop in poetic language and in prose. You'll find, if you read a book like this, like Beowulf, and I really recommend it, start to think about your own writing, and is there any pop in your own choice of words? And if there's not, think about alliteration and assonance. I mean, God, I could read you Gateskill, I could read you Rachel Kushner, I could read you so many writers who have have the poetics in their prose, and you don't notice it unless you're sensitive to the sound of language. And that's a kind of thing that you can do to not leave to do something beautiful and not leave your reader behind, because everybody can enjoy that little bit of extra beauty, a little bit of extra crunch in the prose. Let's see. I wanted one that was let's see if I can find another one. Grendel, enemy to everyone, waged his war. Look for the assonances and the alliterations. Enemy to everyone, waged his war without an army, lonesome as he lapped the luxurious lengths of Harriet. Harriet, Heroat, is the castle, the hall of Beowulf's, the guy he's going to go help out. Luxurious lengths of Heroat. He howl-haunted the hall at night, the gold gifter's throne throwing shade at him. His soul burning with dark flame, he couldn't touch the treasure or tame his yearning, for he'd been spurned by God. So you get, it forces you to up your creativity. It forces your creativity into high gear when you're trying to shape the language that way and get some more, like howl haunted the hall at night. You know, I don't know where she started, what the original was. I do have a Beowulf somewhere I could have done a comparison with, but believe me, howl haunted the hall is not exactly what it was originally. But I bet there was that kind of alliteration in the Old English. The gold gifter's throne, throwing. It's not the kind of thing that the reader is necessarily going to notice, except they're going to notice they're really enjoying the way you're putting words together and not just telling a story in random language, but really looking for a verb that will fit in this extra gift. It's like it's extra. It's like the language is what makes it extra, and in the sense that it's used now, which is extra means, it is special. And you want your language to be special. You want your book to be special, not just another underpitched, 8th grade reading level story. You want to do something on the language level as well as tell your story. And it will help you tell your story. It will unlock things when you start trying to play with a sentence and find what's inside that sentence. Shaping the language to do something interesting right in front of you. Right in that line, you're going to do something interesting. Not just telling a story about some guy who goes hacks a bunch of dragons, but something interesting right there. I think that's what this first person who was worried about the decline of the novel, it's a way to stave that off. This kind of sound, it can be mystifying. Poetry can be mystifying if it wants to be. But when you do this in prose, you're not mystifying anything. You're just making it better. You're just cooking it a little more. You're getting some crunch. Oh, I need some crunch in there. I need some spices in there. And that's not about story. That's about how you're handling the language. What else can I tell you about this? I do recommend the Beowulf. It'll immediately add crunch to your work, promise. Anything else I can tell you about? Well, looks like it's a pretty good wrap up. Unless somebody has more they want to ask me, I will sit here for seconds so I don't miss a question. And then feel free to send me questions. Here's another section of the Beowulf. I just love it. He found 14 fists for hire. So instead of just he found 14 guys, or he located 14 guys, he's going for the F's, right? He found 14 fists for hire, the boldest men of the Geats, the Danes, or the Swedes, I guess, the Geats, the Goths, and enlisted them as fighters. He, as their captain, went aboard to pilot the vessel with sea skill, though keen currents and mean depths, so sea, keen, mean, assonance. Soon it was time to depart. The boat's belly was wet, so alliteration. The boat's belly was wet, and beneath, so boat's belly, beneath the land locks, these warriors met, cheering, bringing battle gear into her bosom, so bringing battle gear into her bosom. As sand spit and surf sang, they pushed off and sent themselves to sea, made men. So there's your anachronism. A made man is a mafia term, so that's kind of funny. The wind sent them surging with a foam-feathered throat. Their bird flew free. So foam-feathered throat. So he's going from the feather, or she is going, the translator at least, is going from the feathered metaphor to the bird, meaning the ship. The bird flew free, sailing with certainty over salt waters. On the second day she sought a shore, and the men saw cliffs, crags uplifting from the ocean. So then we have the seas, cliffs, and crags. This gives such texture to your writing. Boy, I can show you in Gateskill. If you look at Veronica, you'll see that crunch. If you look at Rachel Kushner's The Flamethrowers, you'll see that crunch. I mean, all really good writing does have that crunch in the language. Here's a question. Janine says, is that similar to the Hemingway method, short sentences with vigorous English? I don't think it has to be short. I think it has to have a sense of the shape of language, the shape of words in your mouth, the shape of those consonants. It's almost more on the poetic level. Yeah, Hemingway liked those vigorous English words, thought they were, but you can do it with long words and long sentences too. It's just asking to make the music. Author of the new translation, her name is Maria Davana Headley, and she actually wrote a novel based on one of the characters, Grendel's mother, and Grendel the monster. She wrote a modern novel called The Mere Wife that I've heard is supposed to be really good. After reading this, I want to read it because she's a really good writer. All right, so I will leave you there, and I wish you good writing, and try to get a little music. Try to get a little crunch into your prose. Okie doke. Bye.